At 12:30 a.m. on August 9th, 2013, a man named Kyle Lawson was asleep in his bedroom with his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas, when his cell phone rang and it woke him up. Kyle looked at the caller ID and saw that the call was coming in from his 26-year-old brother, Brandon. And so, Kyle picked it up, but before he could even say hello, his brother said he needed help. And then he launched into this big story that really sounded completely insane. He told Kyle he was currently driving north on Highway 277, which is this totally desolate two-lane country road that runs through West Texas, and that 3 men were chasing Brandon. And on top of that, Brandon told his brother that, he's trying to get away from these men, but his truck was about to run out of gas. And so what he wanted Kyle to do was to, right now in the middle of the night, come meet him secretly to hand off a gas tank so Brandon could officially escape these 3 men. But as Kyle listened to this, he was not really actually concerned, at least in terms of Brandon being in any sort of real danger with regards to these 3 men that were chasing him. In reality, Kyle's reaction to this was just being so annoyed at Brandon. Because after hearing this story, this frantic story Brandon's telling him in the middle of the night, he was sure that really there were no 3 men, that instead his brother Brandon was just high again. And he was hallucinating. He was basically having an episode that was substance-induced. So Brandon had a history of methamphetamine use. He'd been clean for the last 6 months or so, and he'd been working on, being a better partner to his fiancée, Ladessa, and also a better father to his 4 children. But just 2 days ago, Brandon had also called Kyle, but it had been to ask Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Now, Kyle did not immediately say, "Oh, here's where you go to get drugs." Instead, he tried to tell Brandon, don't do it. You should not get high. You're clean. You're doing good. But he was pretty sure Brandon had not listened, because ever since that phone call, even though Kyle didn't give him any, resources for drugs, Brandon must have gone and gotten drugs anyways, because his behavior had just been completely crazy in general. In fact, right now, Kyle knew from having spoken to his parents earlier that the whole reason Brandon was even driving on Highway 277 right now was because he got into a big fight with his fiancée and was supposed to be going to his parents' house to chill out. He was basically going to time out for bad behavior. That's why he was out right now. Now, Kyle knew Brandon was very likely high, and so this was not going to be a good time to reason with Brandon and tell him to, just come home or just go to your parents' house because, there's no such thing as these 3 men. You're just high. He's not going to listen to that. So instead, Kyle just focused on trying to calm Brandon down because, again, Kyle is not thinking Brandon is actually in danger. He's thinking this is just a hallucination. But as Kyle tried to do that, Brandon did not calm down. He got more and more anxious, and he's continuing to talk about these 3 men that are gaining on him. And finally, Kyle just said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" But as Kyle expected, Brandon swore up and down that he was not high, and he just kept on begging Kyle to come help him fast before these men caught up to him, come give me the gas I need so I can escape, come on, man. At this point, Kyle felt like there was no point even talking to Brandon, and in some ways he just wanted to hang up and forget about this whole thing. This was crazy. He has his own life and his own responsibilities, he shouldn't be babysitting his younger brother. But at the same time, Kyle was very close with his brother. Even if, he resented it, he did love his brother very much. And even though he did feel like there is no imminent danger here other than maybe Brandon to himself, Kyle decided, you know what? I'm just gonna go out on Highway 277, I'm gonna find Brandon and just get him back home. So he told Brandon he'd be right there, and then he hung up. About 45 minutes later, Kyle drove north on Highway 277 along with his wife in his passenger seat and their 4-year-old son in the back. Kyle's wife had not wanted him to be out in the middle of the night dealing with his crazy brother all alone, so she'd insisted that she and their son come along. And so as Kyle drove down the road, he kept an eye out for Brandon's truck. Now, to set the scene for you, this really is like a desolate highway. There's no real traffic, and really in either direction, it's just kind of open plains and some shrubs and small trees. This is a big, wide open area. It's pretty easy to see way out in front of you. And so he's got a great view, even though it's nighttime, but he can't see any vehicles. There's no truck, there's nothing. His brother is nowhere to be seen. But Kyle just kept on driving and kept on looking out. He was even just sort of looking out into the fields in case, his brother had veered off the road somewhere, which seemed entirely possible. But eventually, after driving for some time, way up ahead, sort of parked half on the road, half off, was a truck. Its lights were off, it's just sitting there. It's not even idling. It's clearly turned off. But as Kyle got closer, he realized it was Brandon's truck. So he had found Brandon. And so Kyle, he pulls over to the opposite side of the road, and he parks his car, and he tells his wife and his son to stay in the car, and he's going to go talk to Brandon, who at this point Kyle is assuming is sitting in his truck, waiting for Kyle. And also keep in mind, at this point, Kyle's thinking, well, there's nobody else out here. There's no 3 men chasing my brother. He's probably just sitting here, high as can be, and I'm going to talk to him, and he's just going to go home, and we're going to move past this. But when Kyle walked over to the vehicle, there was nobody inside of it. Brandon's gone. And he's thinking to himself, this really doesn't make any sense, because on the ride to the truck, as they were on Highway 277, Brandon kept repeatedly calling Kyle over and over and over again, being like, come on, you gotta hurry up, you gotta get here, they're gaining on me like I'm in trouble, bring that gasoline, you gotta get here. And now that he's here, he's finally reached, clearly, Brandon's truck. It's right here, and Brandon's gone? He's gone from his truck? He didn't tell him that on the phone. Like, where is he? What's going on here? And so Kyle, he's like looking under the vehicle. He's searching the vehicle now for his brother, which is totally crazy. Like, what's his brother doing here? But as he's searching the vehicle for his brother and looking around the area for his brother, Kyle's phone rings, and it's Brandon. And so Kyle, who at this point is feeling really annoyed, he answers the phone and he's like, Brandon, where are you? And Brandon goes, bro, I'm right here. And Kyle's like, no, you're not. Like, I don't see you. There's no one here. Your truck is here. You're not here. But just then, Kyle looked out and there was a car coming towards him. So he saw the headlights and he realized it was a cop car. And so he's on the phone with Brandon. He's looking out at this cop car that's coming up this road towards him and clearly slowing down, like the police officer is going to stop and talk to Kyle, presumably. And so as this cop car is coming in and slowing down right in front of him, Brandon on the phone says to Kyle, run away from that cop. Now think about this. That meant Brandon had to be somewhere nearby because he can clearly see the cop car approaching Kyle. He's watching the scene. Even though Kyle has not found his brother, Brandon is clearly actually nearby. But Kyle, he's sort of quickly interpreting this and he's thinking, like, where is Brandon? Because he's looking out and it's just open fields in either direction on either side of this highway. It's like this barren wasteland out in the middle of Texas. Like, where is he hiding? There's nowhere to hide. There's a couple of shrubs and really small trees sort of off in the distance, but like there's really nowhere to hide. So where is Brandon? And Kyle, he's just feeling furious at this point. Confused, but furious. It's like, what are you doing, Brandon? Like, he knew the reason Brandon wanted Kyle to run also is because Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest that had to do with a drug charge. And so he's just protecting himself, like, don't get involved with the police, like, keep me out of it. And it's like, Kyle, he's already out here in the middle of the night doing this crap for his brother who's completely off his rocker. Like, he was so annoyed, but again, it's like, what does he even do? He has no idea where Brandon is. And so Kyle, he was about to say something to Brandon to demand, where are you? Come out here. But Brandon hung up. Now, by this point, the police officer had arrived on scene. He had parked his car, and he walked over to Kyle, who now is standing right next to his brother's vehicle. He's put his phone back in his pocket. And the officer, when he got close enough, he introduced himself as Deputy Neal of the Coke County Sheriff's Department, and he told Kyle that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker about a stranded driver on the road. And so he asked Kyle if maybe that was him. Is this your truck? Are you the stranded driver? Pointing to Brandon's truck. But Kyle said no, it was not his. It belonged to his brother. But despite how much he really wished he could say the truth, he wanted to protect his brother. So he couldn't tell the deputy that, well, the reason my brother left his car here is because he's probably high on meth and he's somewhere nearby hiding. And also he has a warrant out for his arrest. So instead, Kyle said, well, I think he went off to get some gas because he called me and he said he had run out of gas. So he parked his car here. So he probably has walked on and I just got here. is it okay with you if I get back in the car with my wife and son and just drive up and down the road here to find Brandon? Because I'm sure he's fine, but he called me to help get him gas. So do you mind if I do that? And surprisingly, the deputy was like, yeah, that's fine, go ahead. And so Kyle, he got right back into his car with his wife and his son, and he did fire up his car and he drove farther down the highway. And as he did, he kept looking over his shoulder to see what the cop was gonna do. And the cop was just still parked next to Brandon's car. And eventually, when Kyle drove far enough that he knew the cop couldn't see him anymore, he pulled over to the side of the road and he began really angrily calling his brother over and over and over again to get him back on the phone. But Brandon never answered the calls. And so at this point, Kyle has no idea what's going on with Brandon. I mean, he didn't before, but now especially, he's out of contact with his brother. And so Kyle and his family would sit there for a little bit longer, like continuing to try to get in touch with Brandon, but to no end. And eventually, Kyle's 4-year-old son began crying and complaining because it's so late and he's tired. And Kyle's wife is tired, it's 2 a.m. And Kyle, he's just so over it. He's like, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to come out here and get him out of this mess, but if he doesn't want to be in touch with me and he wants to hide off the side of the highway, that's on him. I'm taking my family and I'm going home. And so that's what he did. He turned around, he drove right back the way he came, and he actually passed by his brother's truck that was still there, so Brandon clearly is still in hiding, and standing next to his brother's truck is still Deputy Neil. He presumably was waiting for Brandon to show back up. He drove right past them, he went back to his home, and they went to bed. And he figured, you know what, tomorrow I will likely hear from Brandon and he'll tell me some crazy story explaining what really happened, but you know what, whatever, that's on him. Not long after Kyle had driven past Deputy Neil on his way back home, Neil decided, you know what, I'm not just gonna sit here all night waiting for Brandon. He had searched Brandon's truck and there was nothing concerning inside of it. There was, no phone, no wallet, no keys, things that people would not leave behind if they ran out of gas and decided to go walk to get gas. So it seemed very much like that is what happened. Brandon had pulled his car over, gotten out, and begun the walk. And then his brother showed up and the whole thing was playing out here. And so Neil figured, okay, well, I have other calls to go to. It doesn't seem like this is a huge emergency. And so he just reached inside the truck, he turned on the hazard lights, then he locked all the doors and shut them. And then he got in his own vehicle and he took off because again, he had other calls to attend to that night. The next morning around 8 a.m., Deputy Neil was back out on Highway 277 just to make sure Brandon had eventually come back and claimed his truck. But no, the truck was still sitting there, hazards on. Now, at this point, Deputy Neil was starting to get a bit concerned about Brandon because, he's out on foot walking to get gas for his truck. And even though it seemed like the risk was sort of low for him, it is possible something could have happened to him. And that's why he had not come back to his truck. Maybe he was hit by a car or, got lost or something. Who knows? Anything could have happened. Or, maybe Brandon decided not to claim his truck yet. Maybe he just went home and he's gonna get it later. But regardless, it just seemed like Neil really had to go follow up personally with Brandon just to make sure he was okay. And so Neil drove back to the sheriff's department to see if he could find the contact information for Brandon. But when he walked in the door, he didn't have any time to do any digging because another employee told him that while he was out, the department had gotten a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa. And Ledessa had given them a very different story than the one Brandon's brother, Kyle, had told Neil the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past few days. And last night, so on the night that this whole truck thing happened, Brandon was supposed to be on his way to his parents' house to cool off from the fight he was having with Ledessa. But he never arrived at his parents' house, and he never came back to Ledessa's house. And so Brandon was totally unaccounted for. And on top of that, nobody could get in touch with Brandon. They were calling and texting him, no response. After hearing this, Deputy Neil was surprised and also pretty angry because clearly Brandon's brother Kyle had acted like everything was totally fine the night before, but that had to have been a lie, because Ledessa is saying this totally different story. And so the first thing Neil did is he went and spoke to Kyle and also to the rest of Brandon's family to get the story straight here. And very quickly, it became clear to Deputy Neil that any omissions or even lies about what had happened exactly on the night that Kyle went missing were not because the family was hiding something. I mean, they were kind of trying to protect Brandon, but it was because they didn't understand how serious this situation really was. And so now that Brandon really was missing and nobody knew what happened to him, the family was very forthright that they really didn't know what had happened to him, and that yes, maybe he was on drugs, we don't know, but he really is missing and you gotta go look for him. And so that's what Neil did. Over the next 4 days, there was this huge search that Neil led all around Highway 277, where the center of the search was where Brandon's truck had been found. But despite using canines and helicopters and these huge search teams, some of which had thermal cameras which would allow you to see body heat, despite covering this vast area all around where Brandon clearly had been, there was absolutely no sign of him. And they also spoke to the homeowners and the property owners sort of roughly in the area to see if maybe they had seen something strange, maybe seen Brandon or those 3 men that apparently had been chasing him on the night he went missing, but nobody had seen anything. And so basically, Brandon was definitely not here. And there was no sign he had been here other than his truck. That was it. And so Deputy Neil and the rest of the authorities who were involved in the search ultimately came to the conclusion that based on the fact that Brandon had clearly been fighting with his fiancée, that he had an active warrant out for his arrest, and that he had not been seen in days and there was no sign of him anywhere, nothing, that what must have happened here is Brandon fled. That he's not here because he chose not to be here. That he was never in any danger. He fled the area, and looking here is going to do nothing. We basically have to wait for Brandon to show up at some point. And so for the most part, this seemed like a pretty open and shut case. Until Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, came into the station in person with a bombshell. On August 13th, 2013, so 4 days after Brandon went missing, this is right around the time the search has been called off, the officer on duty at the Coke County Sheriff's Department sat across from Ledessa. And Ledessa looked extremely upset. And she said that she'd gotten so worried about Brandon that she'd started searching through their cell phone records. And she had found something really concerning. She pulled out a piece of paper and she handed it to the officer, and she pointed at a specific section. And this officer, he realized quickly that this was a printed out copy of Brandon's call logs. And what Ledessa was pointing to was a call that Brandon had made at 12:50 a.m. on the night he disappeared. In between a flurry of calls to Kyle and also to Kyle's wife, Brandon had also placed a call to 911. Ledessa told the officer that the fact that Brandon himself had called 911 actually terrified her, because Brandon would have done practically anything to avoid the police. He was terrified of the police. In fact, she knew from talking to Kyle that Brandon had even suggested to him that he should run from the police on the night he went missing when he saw the cop approaching him. And so she said, look, he would only ever call the police if he truly had to. But she's like, why then, after calling the police, did he presumably run away? It just doesn't make any sense. And all of this came as a total surprise to this officer and to the sheriff's department. Because until this moment, the belief had been that a trucker had called 911 about a stranded driver. And that was how Deputy Neil got involved, and really this whole thing started. But nobody knew there had also been this other 911 call from Brandon himself. The 911 dispatch in the area was tiny, underfunded, and understaffed. And at some point, someone must have just dropped the ball when it came to informing the sheriff's department about Brandon's 911 call, because they really didn't know about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call for themselves. The sheriff's department would contact that 911 dispatch, and they would send them an audio recording of Brandon's call. And when they listened to it, they were shocked. Because one, Brandon 100% sounded like he was in imminent danger. This was not like a low-stakes call from a stranded driver. This was someone who thought they were in real peril here. And then two, if you listen closely, you can hear the sound of somebody else's voice in the background on Brandon's side of the call shortly before it cuts out.
911 emergency.
Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. It's like we're just pushed some guys over. Right here going towards Javelin on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. Got taken to the woods. Please hurry.
Okay, now run that by me.
I'm not talking to him. I actually ran into him.
Ah, you ran into him. Okay.
That's the first guy.
Do you need an ambulance?
Yeah, no, I need the cops.
Okay. Is anybody hurt? Hello? Hello?
And so at this point, authorities are thinking, okay, this doesn't necessarily seem like this is just a disappearance. This might be a murder. I mean, they didn't have a body, but the idea that there's another voice and he's talking about being chased through the woods and there's these men coming after him, I mean, this audio recording gave a lot of legitimacy to that. And so the search, which had just ended, was quickly resumed and expanded dramatically. And for the next year, with all these additional resources being poured in, there was this massive effort to find Brandon Lawson. But they didn't find him. There was no other sign of him. He was just completely gone. They looked everywhere around that highway 277, all over the place near where his truck was. There was no evidence. He was just gone. And so ultimately, Brandon's case went cold. And for the most part, authorities just kind of moved on. But Brandon's family did not move on. His fiancée, Ladessa, would go on to hire 2 private detectives, and they would both conduct these big searches multiple times over around the area where Brandon left his truck and also across the state. But they too also just came up empty. And as the years passed by without answers, Brandon's disappearance captured more people's attention, and it started being featured on TV shows and podcasts. People had all kinds of theories about what had happened. You know, maybe Brandon really was just high and hallucinating, and he wandered off somewhere and got attacked by wild animals. Or maybe he really was being chased by these 3 men, and they kidnapped or killed him, and maybe that voice you hear on the recording was one of those 3 men. Or maybe he really had just fled the area on purpose, like the sheriff's department originally thought. Nobody really knew. And so for 9 years, Brandon's case was full of questions and 0 answers. But then, in January of 2022, a small group of volunteers went out to Highway 277 to the area where Brandon had disappeared, which had been searched so many times over. They, this small group of volunteers, would make the biggest breakthrough in Brandon's case in nearly a decade. While they were combing through this field off the side of the highway, again, a field that had been searched numerous times by hundreds and hundreds of people, these volunteers came across an old pair of shorts and pieces of 2 white shoes. They called the sheriff's department, and very quickly, a team of deputies arrived and cordoned off the area, and they continued the search. And in that same field, not far from the shorts and the shoes, they found a fragment of a human skull. And DNA testing confirmed the skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. Now, you would think that finding some of Brandon's remains would answer at least some of the questions about his disappearance, but actually, it just made the whole thing more baffling, because the area where Brandon's skull was found was right near his truck. It had been searched so many times. There were thermal cameras and canines and helicopters and hundreds of searchers, and nobody found it? Remember, off the side of the highway, this is not some thick forest. It is like this huge, flat field in West Texas with nothing but grass and short cactus plants and scattered trees. Like, this is an easy place to find stuff. Yet this skull fragment was not found, nor were the shorts or the shoes. It just seems so improbable. So where does that leave us? Well, we basically have 2 options here. Option 1 is, despite the enormous manpower, the helicopters, canine units, the thermal cameras that were used, the hundreds of volunteers and searchers that combed this area for years, either they just didn't see the grown man in bright white sneakers who was in this barren strip of West Texas where it's easy to see anything, they just didn't see him. So that's option 1. Or 2, he wasn't there. Brandon was not in the search area when they were looking for him. He was somewhere else. But if you believe option 2, the question becomes, well, where was Brandon? Where was he? Why did he call 911 and then run away and go somewhere else? Why? Where was he? And then also, even if you answer that, how did his skull fragment and his clothes wind up back in the search area 9 years later? It is one of the most profound mysteries on the internet, and to this day, we still don't have a good answer. On October 1st, 1987, 20-year-old Karina Mullen slid some file folders into a metal cabinet at the police station in the rural town of Central City, Kentucky. Karina glanced at her watch. It was the end of her workday, but she wanted to finish this filing before she left. She had only been working at the police station as an office assistant since she moved to Central City from her family farm about 6 weeks earlier. But in that short time, members of the small local police force had embraced her as one of their own, and she'd quickly become part of Central City's law enforcement family. Karina finished up her filing and took a few minutes to say goodbye to the officers on duty. It was Thursday, and she had off the next few days, so she told everyone to have a great weekend and said she'd see them soon. After that, she went outside to her car and drove through town towards the apartment she shared with her 2-year-old daughter and another young single mother who she'd quickly become friends with. Central City was only about 10 minutes from the farm Karina had grown up on, but to her, it felt like kind of a different world. Shops lined the main street, there were a few bars and restaurants in town, and it wasn't too far of a drive to a much bigger city with a thriving nightlife. Karina turned off the main street onto a side road, drove a little further, and then parked in front of her 2-bedroom apartment, which was one of several apartments in a small but crowded complex. Just 6 weeks ago, when she had moved here, this apartment felt like her first real taste of freedom. Now, Karina loved her parents and living on the family farm, but when she had turned 20 very recently, she really wanted to go out on her own, and she wanted to prove to her parents that she could raise her daughter by herself. But things had not quite turned out like she'd hoped. Karina was raising her child while working at the police station and studying to try to get into nursing school, and she just couldn't do it all. In truth, she missed having her mom and dad's help, and so, after only having been in this apartment for a little over a month, she had decided to move back to the farm. Karina stepped into her apartment and walked past the few moving boxes she'd already packed up. She saw her roommate, Angela Smith, getting something to eat in the kitchen. When Karina had dropped the news on Angela that she was leaving to go back to her farm, things had not gone well. Angela felt totally blindsided. She couldn't afford rent by herself, and she had no idea how quickly she could find a new roommate. But Karina had told her she wouldn't just disappear overnight. She would take her time moving out, and she'd try to help Angela get situated with rent before leaving, and so as a result, the tension had begun to ease between them. And this particular evening, the two women were less stressed than usual, because it was just them in the apartment. Karina's daughter was at the farm with Karina's parents, and Angela's ex had her daughter for the weekend. So Karina sat down with Angela in the kitchen, and they began chatting about work for a while. But at some point, Angela got a bit giddy and said she really just wanted to hear the latest gossip on Karina's boyfriend. Karina sighed and kind of laughed at herself. She'd recently broken up with her boyfriend, a guy named Jimmy Springer, who she'd had this on-again, off-again relationship with for 8 months. But almost in the same breath as talking about the most recent breakup with Jimmy, Karina told Angela that Jimmy was actually coming by later to spend the night. Karina knew this sounded sort of ridiculous, but even though she'd just cut Jimmy loose a few days earlier, she was looking forward to seeing him that night when her daughter was gone and they could just be alone together. At 9 a.m. the following morning, October 2nd, a city worker was driving to a job not far from the center of town when he noticed something that seemed totally out of place. Behind the parking garage used by the Central City Street Department, he saw an old 1977 Chevrolet car. This didn't make much sense because people from town normally never parked over here, and he knew this car didn't belong to anyone who worked for the street department. The worker parked his truck and hopped out. He wanted to make sure there wasn't someone in the car who might need help or something. He walked towards the car, and at first he didn't see anybody inside. But when he was just a few feet away, he got a good look at the trunk. And without thinking, the worker turned around, ran to the nearest open shop, asked to use the phone, and called 911. Minutes later, Lieutenant Billy Fields of the Central City Police Department arrived at the scene with several other local police officers. Fields got out of his car. He was in his mid-40s and was one of the most experienced cops on the force. He saw the parked 1977 Chevrolet, and from where he was standing, it was clear there were bloodstains on the outside of the trunk. When the other cops looked at Fields and then over at the car he had just stared at, it hit them why he was so upset. They all recognized the Chevy. It belonged to their co-worker and friend, Karina Mullen. Fields walked closer to the car, and he saw blood smears that went into the trunk, like whoever had been bleeding might actually be in the trunk. Lieutenant Fields noticed the trunk was not actually closed all the way, so he reached down and opened it, and as soon as he did, He shouted and just turned away. The other officers walked over to him and saw what he was looking at, and when they did, they all looked away too. They had just seen their friend, Karina, laying in the trunk, and she was obviously deceased. She was naked, covered in dried blood, with cuts on her hands and neck. Her nose had been smashed in, and there were dark bruises covering most of her body. Fields and the other officers did their best to collect themselves. This was a small-town police force that dealt mainly with petty theft and domestic disputes. They occasionally had to tackle larger drug-related crimes in the area, but none of them had dealt with anything like this. Not to mention the victim was somebody they all knew and cared about. Fields told them he knew how upsetting this was, but they still had a job to do. So he and a couple of officers turned back to the trunk and did a more thorough search, while others opened the car and looked inside. Fields found a bloody comforter from a bed stuffed into the trunk next to Karina's body, along with jeans and a pair of women's underwear. There was a lot of blood in the trunk, but Fields said there would be a lot more if she was actually killed in the trunk or in the car, versus being killed elsewhere and then moved to the car. The officers who had searched the rest of the car said they did find a few small bloodstains, but nothing that would indicate the attack had actually taken place inside the vehicle. So as a result, Lieutenant Fields and the others began to think that Karina must have been murdered somewhere else and then thrown into her trunk and dumped here. The bloody comforter could have been used to carry her from the murder scene to the car, and it only made sense that that comforter would have come from a bedroom. Later that day, after Karina's body had been removed from the trunk and the clothes and the bloody comforter had been bagged as evidence, Lieutenant Fields knocked on the front door of Karina's apartment. A young detective and several uniformed officers stood behind him. Karina's roommate, Angela, opened the door. Even though it was the afternoon, she looked like she'd either just rolled out of bed or hadn't slept all night. Angela had met most of these officers before, and she knew they worked with Karina, and so she asked them if they needed Karina for something work-related. But Fields didn't waste any time. He bluntly told Angela that Karina was dead and the police needed to search the apartment. Angela backed away from the door, either too shocked or too scared to say anything. Fields told her to wait right there, and then he and the other officers stepped inside. And immediately, they felt like they had found the murder scene. There was no sign of forced entry at the door, but they could clearly see bloodstains on the carpet. They followed the bloodstains down a short hallway to a closed door. Fields opened it, and when he and the others stepped inside, they knew this had to be Karina's bedroom. They saw photos of her, her parents, and her little girl. But they also saw a scene of complete horror. Blood spatter covered the wall above the bed, and the sheets looked like they had been soaked in blood. The officers also saw there was no comforter on the bed. There was no question this had to be where Karina had been killed. And so Fields sent the uniformed officers to canvass the apartment complex. The units were all close together, and the walls looked pretty thin. He thought somebody must have heard a violent attack last night. Fields and the young detective walked back through the apartment, and Fields barked at Angela to join them in the kitchen. Fields was usually a pretty easygoing guy, very calm on the job, but this case had already put him on edge. Fields and the detective sat down with Angela at the kitchen table, and Fields asked her when she had last seen Karina. Angela told him that they'd both gone out to a club last night, since neither of their daughters were home, and they'd gotten back at around maybe midnight. They'd been drinking pretty heavily, so they both went to bed not long after that. Fields snapped right back. He didn't care how much she'd been drinking. This was a small apartment, and the two bedrooms shared a wall. There was no way Angela didn't hear what happened in Karina's room, and there was no way she didn't see the bloodstains on the carpet when she woke up. Angela hung her head and fought back tears, and as she did, Fields asked her if she was hiding something from them. She stayed silent for a second, and then nodded. She said she hadn't just been drinking the night before. She'd also taken a bunch of painkillers and totally blacked out. She said she was just kind of starting to feel normal again, and so that's why she hadn't heard anything the night before or noticed the bloodstains when she finally woke up. Lieutenant Fields took a breath and eased off a bit. He'd worked enough drug cases in the area to know that the right combination of booze and pills could basically make someone seem dead to the world for a while. This meant there was a chance Angela was actually telling the truth, that she really had no idea what happened over the last 10-12 hours. Fields and the young detective gave Angela a minute to collect herself, Then the young detective asked if there was anyone she could think of in Karina's life who might have wanted to hurt her. Angela said there was one obvious choice: Karina's on-again, off-again boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Fields and the detective looked at each other. They didn't know a ton about Karina's boyfriend, but they'd heard enough from her at work to know her relationship had its share of drama. Fields asked if Angela knew the last time Karina had seen Jimmy. Karina closed her eyes and tried to fight back tears. She said last night, before Karina went to bed, she had told her to keep the front door unlocked, because Jimmy was coming over late and he was going to be spending the night. After leaving the apartment, Lieutenant Fields caught up with the uniformed officers who'd canvassed the area, and they told him that nobody had heard anything strange last night. This made no sense. The complex was small and the walls looked thin. How had nobody heard anything? Fields said he would try to figure that out later. He told the young detective to go track Jimmy down and call him in for an interview. In the meantime, Fields would have to drive out to Karina's family farm. News of a violent crime like this in such a small town would spread fast, and he did not want Karina's parents to find out that their daughter had been murdered from the TV. That afternoon, Fields sat down with Karina's parents in a large open room with high ceilings in their farmhouse, and he told them the news. Karina's mother broke down immediately, but her father just stared off into space, almost like his mind had gone completely blank. All Fields could do was tell them how sorry he was and how he would do everything in his power to find her killer. He told them that Karina was part of the family at the police department, and nobody would get away with doing this to her. Fields told the parents that he didn't want to intrude on their grief, but he wondered if they knew anything about Karina's latest boyfriend, Jimmy Springer. Karina's mom forced herself to stop crying for a second, and she got an angry look on her face. She said Jimmy was no good for her little girl. He was jealous all the time and he had a bad temper. Karina's dad quickly added that this was not just typical jealous boyfriend stuff that might be expected from a young man. He told Lieutenant Fields that a few weeks earlier, Karina had come to the farmhouse and her face was all red. When he asked her what had happened, she told him that Jimmy had grabbed her, dragged her into the bathroom, and rubbed off all of her makeup with a washcloth because he didn't like her wearing makeup when she was out. Fields assured the parents that the police were already working to bring Jimmy in for questioning. He said he would update them about the case as quickly and as often as he could. He told them again how sorry he was, then said goodbye and walked back outside to his car. On the night of October 2nd, so a little over 12 hours after Karina's body had been found, Lieutenant Fields sat with the Central City Chief of Police and the county sheriff in an interview room at the sheriff's department. Fields had been right, and the story of Karina's murder had already made the nightly news in cities all over the area. This was by far the biggest crime to have hit Central City in recent memory. So the chief and the sheriff wanted to make sure they handled everything by the book and that they could control the story in the media as much as possible. Just then, a deputy led Jimmy Springer into the room. Jimmy was 19 years old, tall and skinny, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He currently lived a little less than 2 hours away in Nashville, Tennessee, but police had found him staying with a friend in Central City. Jimmy sat down, and right away the sheriff asked him if he knew why he was there. Jimmy had already heard about Karina, so he responded by saying he had nothing to do with her death. The police chief asked Jimmy where he'd been the night before, and Jimmy said he'd gone to a local bar with a couple of friends just to have a few beers. Afterward, he swung by Karina's apartment, but when he knocked on the door, nobody answered, so he headed to his friend's house and crashed there for the night. The chief didn't hold back. He told Jimmy he thought he was lying. Karina's roommate had told police she left the door unlocked for Jimmy, so why didn't he just walk in? Jimmy sat there for a second and began to shift in his seat uncomfortably, but he stuck to his story. The investigators kept pushing, but Jimmy didn't budge. He just kept saying he had nothing to do with Karina's murder. Now, despite the fact that everybody in that room thought Jimmy was not telling them everything, the chief and the sheriff recognized that they didn't really have any clear evidence tying Jimmy to the murder yet, so they let him go. This decision baffled Lieutenant Fields. He argued that they were just letting Karina's killer walk out the door. On October 5th, 3 days after Karina's body was found, Fields sat at his desk reading over the medical examiner's autopsy report. The report did not surprise Fields, based on what he already knew about the case. Karina had been cut several times with a blade and had been beaten badly with a blunt object. She had also been raped before she was killed. The medical examiner believed that this had all taken place the night before Karina's body had been found in the trunk of her car. Lieutenant Fields believed this autopsy report made Jimmy look even more guilty. The violence inflicted on Karina showed the kind of rage that police often saw in cases involving jealous boyfriends and husbands. But Fields had been told he couldn't go after Jimmy yet, so he had to be patient. The comforter, clothing, and other pieces of evidence found in the trunk of Karina's car and at her apartment had already been sent off to the state crime lab for testing. And Fields knew that those test results might help police close the case whenever they came in. While Fields read over the autopsy report again, an officer approached his desk and told him he'd just come across something important that had somehow gone overlooked. On the day before Karina's murder, a young man had called into the station saying he witnessed someone threatening Karina with a gun. And this alleged gunman was somebody the police in town knew all too well. His name was Jeffrey Lee Boyd, and he was the biggest drug dealer in Central City. The fact that this had gone overlooked didn't actually come as a shock or anything to Fields. This was a small police force with limited resources, and as soon as Karina's body had been found, everything else had sort of gotten pushed aside. Fields knew Jeffrey Lee Boyd well enough to know that he and his crew of drug dealers were very dangerous, and so Fields didn't want to just go after Jeffrey on potential murder charges unless he really had to. So he asked this officer to go find the witness and tell them to come down to the station. A little later that day, Fields met with this witness. But after only a few minutes of questioning, the young man's story began to fall apart. He went from accusing Jeffrey of sticking a gun in Karina's face to saying he actually wasn't positive Jeffrey had a gun at all, to admitting he hadn't even gotten a clear look at the man with Karina, so he couldn't even guarantee that it was Jeffrey. After the interview, Fields told his team it had felt like a big waste of time speaking to this witness. Jeffrey was definitely a known drug dealer and he'd done prison time in the past, but that didn't automatically mean he was Karina's killer. And if the police chief felt like they didn't have enough evidence to go after Karina's boyfriend Jimmy, then there was no way he was going to have them pursue a lead based on an eyewitness account that was flimsy at best. So, a few days into the investigation, the team already felt like they were treading water. And at the same time, Fields began receiving regular phone calls from Karina's dad, who was desperate for any updates. But Fields just kept apologizing and saying he had nothing new to report. On October 28th, so almost a month after Karina's murder, the police chief called Lieutenant Fields into his office and told him he had some big news. He'd just gotten a call from police in Nashville, Tennessee, and they'd picked up Karina's boyfriend Jimmy for stealing a computer from his work. They were currently holding him on grand larceny charges, but Jimmy had been talking a lot about the murder in Central City, and so they wanted the chief to know. And now the chief and the sheriff were going to Nashville to question Jimmy again. Fields felt a rush of excitement. He said he knew they didn't have any test results from the lab yet, but he was sure Jimmy was their guy. That night, Fields paced back and forth in the police station, anxiously waiting for any news. Most of the other officers waited with him. There was the sense that the chief's trip to Nashville was going to help bring this case to a close and finally get justice for their friend Karina. Finally, late that night, Fields' phone rang. He grabbed it and he heard the chief's voice on the other end. And the chief said Fields was not going to believe what had just gone down in Nashville. Jimmy had not confessed to the murder, but he had admitted to going into Karina's apartment that night. Fields knew this was a huge deal. It meant Jimmy had flat out lied to the police the first time he spoke to them. But the chief said there was something way bigger than that. Jimmy said he had gone to Karina's bedroom and seen blood, but instead of calling the police, he had driven around town looking for Karina himself, and when he didn't find her, he just went to his friend's house and fell asleep. This had to be one of the most unbelievable, ridiculous alibis the chief or Fields had ever heard in their law enforcement careers. And so a few minutes later, when Fields hung up the phone, he felt this huge sense of relief. the chief and the sheriff were ready to put together a case against Jimmy, because they too now believed he was the killer. On July 19, 1988, so 9 months after Karina's body had been found, her boyfriend, Jimmy, went on trial for her murder. Some officers who worked in the state crime lab felt like this case had actually been rushed to trial, because when the lab had finally tested evidence from the case, the results had not tied Jimmy directly to the murder scene. So the case against Jimmy was based entirely on circumstantial evidence. But Fields and other members of the Central City Police believed their case against Jimmy was still strong, and they expected a conviction. After a couple of days, the trial ended, and the jury deliberated for only an hour. Fields sat in the courtroom feeling a rush of anticipation as the jury foreman read the verdict, and Fields heard the words, "Not guilty." Fields felt like he had just gotten the wind completely knocked out of him. He'd spent a huge part of almost a year doing everything he could to ensure that Jimmy would go to prison for killing Karina. Now, any hope of that was gone. The police officers filed out of the courtroom feeling utterly defeated and like they had failed their friend and her family. And with 9 months of work basically erased, they had no idea where to restart the investigation. During the weeks following Jimmy's trial, Lieutenant Fields felt like he was scrambling. But he and his team did decide to revisit the possibility that the killer could be Jeffrey Lee Boyd, that drug dealer who may or may not have threatened Karina with a gun. And this time, when they looked into it, they discovered something new about Jeffrey. He was close friends, and maybe even lovers, with Karina's roommate, Angela. The team immediately went back to their early notes from the case, and they quickly found something else they had missed. The medical examiner's toxicology report made it clear that no alcohol or drugs were present in Karina's body when she was killed. But Angela had told Fields and the other detective that she and Karina had been drinking heavily the night of the murder. Fields said he was frustrated with himself. These oversights could be chalked up to a small team handling a case that might be too big for them, but he apologized for what he saw as a massive misstep on his part. Still, they now had a clear connection between the drug dealer, Jeffrey, and the victim, and they now believed the victim's roommate had lied to them. So, in August of 1988, 10 months after the murder, Fields brought in Angela for another interview. But all she could say was that, maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe she only thought Karina was drinking a bunch when they went out, because she herself had been really drunk and on painkillers. Following his talk with Angela, Lieutenant Fields tracked down 25-year-old Jeffrey at his house, and he happened to be there with an 18-year-old drug dealer named Kramer, who cops believed worked for Jeffrey. The two dealers made an odd-looking pair. Jeffrey was this tall, massive guy who had no problem physically intimidating people, while Kramer was skinny and barely stood 5 feet tall. Fields talked to them for a while at the house, but when he got back to the station, he told the chief that both young men had barely said a thing. This seemed par for the course, though, because Jeffrey, who had been questioned many times in the past by police, sorta knew to keep his mouth shut. Even though Jeffrey had started to seem like a strong suspect on the surface, as the investigation went on, Fields was not able to produce enough evidence to convince anyone that they had a case against Jeffrey. And once Jeffrey fell off the radar, the investigation began to dry up. In fact, as brokenhearted as police officers and the people who knew Karina still were, there seemed to be an effort from everybody to just move on. Like the only way for the town to heal was to put this horrific murder case behind them, despite it being unsolved. And so as months and then years went by, there were only 2 men who seemed to still be actively looking for Karina's murderer. That was her father and Lieutenant Fields. Sometimes, Fields would even pick up Karina's dad at the farm, and they would just drive around together, looking for any potential clue that they might have missed. But those clues never surfaced, and the years kept passing by. Eventually, Lieutenant Fields retired from the force, and then once Fields was gone, Karina's dad convinced the state police to pick up the investigation. And they tried for a time to solve the murder, but eventually, they also let the case go. Finally, after over a decade of searching, Karina's mom convinced her husband that he needed to drop the case too. They could not spend the rest of their lives hunting for a killer that nobody could find. That is not what Karina would have wanted for them. In June of 2006, over 18 years after Karina's murder, Detective Damon Fleming of the Kentucky State Police sat at his desk digging through old notebooks and file folders. The state police had recently made an effort to revitalize cold cases, and Detective Fleming had been assigned to Karina's murder investigation. Fleming knew the case had long since disappeared from public consciousness, but when he took it over, he had gotten the word out to the media in and around Central City that the investigation had been reopened. And if anybody had information, no matter how insignificant they thought it might be, they should contact the state police. Sitting at his desk, Fleming heard someone call his name. He looked up from the notebook he was reading, and he saw an officer there with this woman who appeared to be in her 30s, and she looked absolutely terrified. Detective Fleming asked what he could do for her, and she said she needed to talk to him in private. Fleming stood up, signaled for the other officer to leave, and then he led the woman into a conference room. He closed the door behind them, and then sat down across from her at a long wooden conference table. As soon as she sat down, the woman kept glancing over her shoulder like she thought somebody was following her. But Fleming assured her they were totally safe in here, and he asked her why she needed to see him. Tears began running down the woman's cheeks as she cleared her throat, and then she told him her name was Samantha Robinson, and that when she was 16 years old, she had witnessed the brutal murder of Karina Mullen. Detective Fleming sat there, silent and almost in awe of this woman, and by the time she stopped talking, he knew that she had given him all of the information he would need to finally close Karina's murder case after almost 20 years. Based on Samantha's story and evidence and interviews from multiple investigations conducted over 18 years, this is what police believe happened to Karina on the night of October 1st, 1987. On that night, 16-year-old Samantha Robinson was walking down the middle of a street in Capital City, Kentucky towards her house when she heard a car behind her. Samantha turned and saw headlights rapidly approaching, so she hopped up onto the sidewalk to get out of the way. Suddenly, the car came to a screeching halt right alongside her. The driver's door and the front passenger door flew open, and two men came out and rushed towards her. The driver grabbed Samantha and she kicked and screamed, but there was no way she could get out of his grip. The passenger opened up one of the back doors, and the driver shoved Samantha into the back seat and then slammed the door shut behind her. Samantha looked next to her, and there was the group's leader, sitting in the back seat, smiling at her. The car lurched forward, and a few minutes later, it pulled up to Karina's apartment. The back door of the car opened, and the driver and passenger grabbed Samantha and pulled her out of the car and up towards the apartment, while their leader followed behind, holding a metal club in one of their hands. The driver opened the door to Karina's apartment and told Samantha to keep her mouth shut if she wanted to live. The leader walked past them and right to Karina's bedroom, where Karina was sleeping. The driver and passenger followed with Samantha and then threw Samantha to the bedroom floor. Karina woke up and saw all the people in her room and began to scream, but the leader jumped on top of her and began beating her stomach with the metal club until she went quiet. At this point, the leader climbed off of Karina, off the bed, and motioned to the driver. This man drew a knife from his hip, climbed onto the bed with Karina, and made shallow cuts into Karina's neck, arms, and stomach. After that, the driver, with the knife, and then the passenger, and then the leader, all raped Karina. Afterwards, they stepped away from the bed, and for a second, Samantha, who was on the ground, hoped and prayed they would just leave. But the leader raised the metal club, rushed back to the bed, and smashed Karina in the head and nose with it. Karina's nose broke, blood sprayed all over the wall and ran into the sheets, and Karina began to choke, at which point the group just stood there and watched her die. After Karina was dead, the leader told the other two to wrap Karina up in her comforter. They followed the orders and carried Karina in her comforter out of the apartment. The leader picked up Karina's car keys off the bedside table, then yanked Samantha up off the floor and dragged her outside. The leader opened up the trunk of Karina's '77 Chevrolet that was parked out front and told the others to dump Karina inside of it. Then the leader handed the car keys to Samantha and told her if she drove them to the parking garage near the center of town, they might let her live. Shaking and terrified, Samantha did as she was told. She climbed into the driver's seat with the killers and drove them to a spot behind the parking garage in town and parked the car. And then in a flash, this teenage girl killed the engine, took the keys out of the ignition, leapt out of the car, and threw the keys as far away as she could. By the time the killers knew what had happened, Samantha was already running through the shadows and making her way home. The leaders sat in the car for a second and just started laughing. They said there was no way this little girl would ever rat them out. She would spend the rest of her life in constant fear that if she did, they would find her and kill her. And so all three of the killers got out of Karina's car and walked through town, covered in blood. The driver and the passenger went their own way, and the leader walked home, showered, and went to bed. The following morning, the killer's leader got dressed, grabbed their badge and gun, and headed to their place of work, the police station. The drug dealer, Jeffrey Lee Boyd, and his 18-year-old friend Kramer helped carry out Karina's murder. But their leader, the one who was in charge of the murder, also happened to become the lead investigator on Karina's murder, Lieutenant Billy Fields. It would turn out Lieutenant Fields was at the top of the drug trade in Central City, giving out orders and providing police cover while Jeffrey ran things on the street. But Jeffrey just couldn't keep quiet. One day, while he was hanging out with Karina's roommate, Angela, he let it slip that he had cops working with him and protecting him, and Karina heard all of this. Jeffrey quickly realized he'd made a huge mistake, so the day before the murder, he got his gun and threatened to kill Karina if she talked, just like the witness described seeing. But Fields thought that was not enough. The only way to be sure they would not get caught was to kill her. Fields and Jeffrey were sadistic, though. Murder wasn't enough for them. So when they were driving to Karina's and saw that teenager Samantha on the street, they decided to grab her and make her watch what happened next. And what happened next is they raped and killed Karina and forced Kramer to participate. But Karina's roommate Angela had been in her bedroom and heard everything that night. But they threatened to kill her if she talked. Jeffrey came up with the story about Angela and Karina going out and drinking and taking pills for Angela to tell the police. Fields also told Jeffrey to threaten everybody who lived in that apartment complex. That's why when they were asked by police, all those neighbors said they didn't hear anything. After that, Fields made sure to personally overlook whatever needed to be overlooked in the investigation in order to steer it away from him and his partners. Karina's boyfriend Jimmy almost turned out to be the perfect patsy for Fields. But in court, Jimmy's lawyers argued that police had bullied and manipulated him into saying things that were not true, and so he was acquitted. And after Jimmy was found not guilty, Lieutenant Fields led the investigation into his own accomplices, but he made sure to steal evidence from the police station to make sure his accomplices didn't actually look guilty, so eventually the case went cold. It would take almost 20 years for Samantha to finally get over her fear of Fields and Jeffrey. When she heard the case had been reopened, she went straight to the state police and told them everything. She said she owed it to Karina. Angela ultimately aided the prosecution and was only charged with perjury. She did not serve any jail time. As for the killers, Kramer was sentenced to 60 years in prison, and Jeffrey and Lieutenant Billy Fields were sentenced to life. In December of 2015, 65-year-old professor David Lennick was meditating in his seat as his plane landed at Philadelphia International Airport. David was an economics professor at a university in Los Angeles, and he also ran a meditation group on campus. Meditation kept David grounded, especially during long and noisy flights like this one from LA to Philly. David took another cleansing breath as the plane rolled toward the gate. A few minutes later, he stood up to grab his luggage from the overhead compartment, and as he did, a sharp pain pierced his cheek, just to the left of his nose. David flinched and instinctively reached up and began massaging the pain point, which helped a little bit. He moved down the aisle toward the exit door, still rubbing his cheek, and slowly the pain dissipated. David had never experienced a muscle spasm like that, but he chalked it up to exhaustion and headed for the baggage claim. 3 months later, in March, David tapped his fingers on the exam table at his doctor's office. He was feeling nervous. Since his trip to Philadelphia, he'd experienced a few more painful spasms in his cheek. But over the last week, those sharp bursts of pain had become a daily occurrence. He was worried they could be related to his history with brain surgery. Almost 20 years earlier, David was diagnosed with pituitary adenoma, a small benign tumor located on his pituitary gland, which is just behind the nose. And so he had to undergo brain surgery and also radiation treatments to remove the tumor. But he'd been free of symptoms ever since. However, now he was worried that the tumor might be back, or that something related to the surgery might be causing this new pain. So he'd come in for an MRI and other tests. A few moments later, his doctor walked into the room. He had good news. David's tumor was not back. In fact, the doctor couldn't find anything physically wrong with him at all. He asked if David was under more stress than usual. It was possible that the pain could actually be psychological. That didn't mean the pain was imaginary, just that it might stem from a combination of factors. But that did not sound plausible to David. He was an avid meditator, which gave him an excellent coping mechanism for stress. Besides, nothing was really weighing on him. He had actually been enjoying himself over the past few months, except for these new cheek spasms. He told the doctor as much, and then said he wanted a second opinion. The doctor nodded and said he had an idea. He recommended that David go see an ear, nose, and throat specialist, or ENT, and he promised he would send in the referral right away. Two weeks later, David walked out of that ENT's office feeling frustrated. The ENT had ordered more scans of David's head and had found that he had a deviated septum, which meant the cartilage that divided David's nostrils was off-center. But the ENT didn't think a deviated septum would cause this stabbing pain in David's cheek. And like David's other doctor, the ENT also concluded that the pain might be psychological. And then he proceeded to ask David if he was under extra stress at work. Nothing David said could convince the ENT otherwise. So eventually David gave up. He would just have to find a different way of dealing with these spasms. Another few weeks later, David paced at the front of a lecture hall, flicking through a PowerPoint presentation, and he had just arrived on the final slide when the pain in his cheek returned. And it returned like an explosion, sending sharp bolts of pain across his whole face. He winced so hard he nearly dropped the clicker in his hand, but then tried his best to recover. He didn't want his students to know that anything was wrong here, but at the same time, it felt like the muscles beneath his skin were literally on fire. He took a deep breath and tried to use his meditating skills and put mind over matter here and get through the presentation, but he couldn't. The pain was so intense, he had to end the lecture early. Back in his office, David rushed over to his desk, opened up his lunchbox, and fished out the ice pack he'd brought to keep his food fresh. Then he placed it on his face, hoping it would take the edge off his pain. At that moment, he knew for sure that so far his doctors had been wrong. This was not a psychological problem. Something was physically wrong here. He just needed to find the right doctor who could prove that. 10 minutes later, David's cheek was still throbbing despite this ice pack. So he put the ice pack away and then stepped into the hallway to call his dentist. He figured, maybe if the problem wasn't in his ears, nose, or throat, maybe it was in his teeth. About a month later, David sat in a reclining dental chair, trying his best to breathe calmly as an oral pain specialist shot streams of cold water directly into the painful side of his mouth. David had gone to see his dentist, who then referred him to this specialist. But this specialist didn't find anything physically wrong with David's teeth. So he proposed an unusual way to help David cope with what appeared to be a psychological problem. He wanted to train David's mind to simply ignore the shooting pain in his left cheek. And so the specialist told David to open and close his mouth while he, the specialist, shot streams of cold water at David's gums. David opened his mouth and tried hard not to flinch as the specialist did this, but each burst of water felt like he had touched a live wire. David tried to ignore the pain, but by the time the specialist finally put down the water scaler and handed him a paper towel, his whole jaw was throbbing. The specialist slid his stool back from the dental chair and then told David to mimic this exercise at home, and eventually he would get results. In the meantime, he was going to prescribe David an antidepressant that's also sometimes used to treat facial pain. David was not optimistic here. He felt like he had just undergone a round of torture for nothing. But he would try the medication and try the exercise and see if maybe this specialist was right. But a month later, in the summer of 2016, David was meeting with a new oral pain specialist named Dr. Parker. For weeks now, he'd been trying the cold water exercise and the antidepressants, but the jolting pain had only gotten worse. And so he hoped Dr. Parker could finally figure out what was going on here. When Dr. Parker finished up her physical exam of David, she proposed an idea. She thought they should maybe try direct injections to the area that was triggering the pain. She would inject local anesthetic directly into his cheek, into a taut band of skeletal muscle, and maybe get the muscles to relax for a while. She said that should give David some relief. David thought this sounded like a wonderful idea, and he was game to try it. So Dr. Parker readied the anesthetic, then injected it directly into his cheek. The pain of getting this injection was shocking, but David was pretty used to shocking pain by now, so he just gritted his teeth and held still. Once Dr. Parker was done and had removed the needle, at first, David's cheek was just pulsing with pain. But slowly, the pain subsided, and for the first time in months, he just felt normal again. He'd never been so grateful for a moment without pain. Dr. Parker smiled and told David to come back and see her in 2 weeks for another injection. He would need them indefinitely to manage the spasms. David hated the thought of undergoing that treatment twice a month for the foreseeable future. But until doctors could find the root cause of his pain, it was his only course of treatment that actually worked. In January of 2009, David flipped through a magazine in the waiting room at a new medical office. After almost 3 years of finding partial relief through those trigger point injections to his cheek, he had decided to seek help from a new doctor, a neurologist. The injections were still helpful, but they weren't working as well as they did at first. The constant, awful pain in his cheek was back. It was bad during the day, but it got worse when he lay down at night. It made sleeping miserable, leaving David tired all the time. Plus, his insurance only covered part of the injections. At the end of 2018, when he sat down to review his spending for the year, he was shocked by how much he had paid out of pocket for his injections. And so that motivated him to start searching for answers again, because those injections were just band-aids. He needed to find the root cause and fix that. Since the spasms had begun back in 2015, 3 different specialists had told him that the problem was psychological. David wanted to believe them, but he had never been convinced. So he decided to see a neurologist, a doctor who specializes in disorders of the brain. He figured maybe it was a physical problem with his brain, not a mental one. Just then, a nurse called his name, and he followed her back to a sterile, beige-colored room where he sat down on the exam table. Soon after that, a young neurologist knocked on the door and introduced herself as Dr. Bashar. She asked David to walk her through his symptoms. David told her the whole story, about the constant stabbing feeling in his cheek and the limited success he'd had with trigger point injections. Dr. Bashar listened as she began a thorough examination of his face, paying extra attention to the painful spot just to the left of his nose. And when she was done with the exam, she told David that she actually had a whole new diagnosis for him. In her opinion, David had a condition called trigeminal neuralgia, or TN. David had never heard of it. She explained that TN is caused by damage to the trigeminal nerve, which is responsible for carrying sensations like pain from the face to the brain. TN can be triggered by a variety of things: a blood vessel pressing on the nerve, an injury from a sinus surgery or dental work, and in some cases, an unknown cause. But unfortunately, the result is the same. TN is one of the most painful conditions known to medicine. It's called a suicide disease because in the years before doctors were able to help patients manage the pain used to get so intense that some patients would choose to end their own lives rather than deal with the horrible disease. David thought back to how severe his pain had gotten before the trigger point injections he was getting. He couldn't imagine living with that pain for years on end. Dr. Bashar said she needed more information about his condition before she would know how to help him. There was yet another specialist she wanted him to go see. So, a few weeks after his appointment with Dr. Bashar, David was at another neurologist's office, sitting beside a metal cart filled with what looked like computer equipment. It was an electromyography machine, or EMG, that would measure the function of David's face muscles. The neurologist taped numerous electrodes to David's face and then turned on the EMG. Almost immediately, David felt a whole bunch of sharp little electric pulses pricking his skin. But this pain was nothing compared to the face pain he had been experiencing for the last 4 years, so he didn't mind. The machine clicked and pulsed for nearly an hour, and by the end of it, David barely noticed the electric pinpricks. When the EMG finally turned off, David's neurologist removed the electrodes from his face and moved to the EMG monitor to look over the results. He told David there was some good news. His TN was not being caused by a neuromuscular disorder like multiple sclerosis. Unfortunately, though, the EMG did not reveal what was causing it either. David just sighed. After 4 years of disappointing news from specialist after specialist, he had become hopeful after finally getting properly diagnosed that he had TN. And he was now hopeful that this EMG would finally uncover a proper treatment for his pain. But clearly it had not. And so he asked the neurologist if there was anything else he could do. The neurologist paused and then said that typically in this situation, he would opt for brain surgery to help treat David's pain and fix the damaged nerve. But given that David had already had brain surgery to remove the pituitary tumor back in 1997, the neurologist did not feel comfortable recommending another brain surgery. To him, brain surgery should be a true last resort. First, he wanted David to try managing the pain with painkillers. He told him to literally try every one on the market. Two years later, in the winter of 2021, David was once again sitting in a dentist chair, but this time for a routine procedure, a crown replacement. He tried to hold still as his dentist pushed a syringe of Novocaine into his gums, but the needle was triggering his TN and making the numbing process overwhelmingly painful. For the past 2 years, David had been dutifully working his way through a laundry list of painkillers. But instead of getting better, David's pain remained basically constant. In fact, the spasms were so unrelenting that most days he couldn't think straight. He couldn't even meditate anymore, something that had been a daily practice and comfort to him for years. He was frustrated and exhausted with the whole ordeal, and perfectly understood now why TN used to be called the suicide disease. Thankfully, the Novocaine his dentist had given him did eventually set in, and the pain in his cheek finally dulled. It was the first time in a while that there hadn't been pain in his cheek. And so even as his dentist began drilling away at the crown on his back tooth, David simply sat there and enjoyed the temporary relief. But that afternoon, when the Novocaine wore off, the pain came back with a vengeance. He grabbed an ice pack out of the freezer and pressed it to his cheek, hoping it would numb the pain. And it did, a little bit, so that night he literally slept on the ice pack. But it just was not enough. The throbbing pain in his cheek continued. David felt like he was going crazy. He knew that there had to be a proper treatment out there somewhere. A doctor who could figure out what was actually causing his TN and help him fix it. So once again, David started Googling, looking for new specialists to call. A few months later, in June of 2021, David had just wrapped up a lecture when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was his newest doctor's office. David had been waiting for this call for weeks. After his most recent horrible experience at the dentist, he had made yet another appointment with another neurologist. And after this neurologist thoroughly examined him, they told David something startling. In her opinion, David did not have TN at all. The pain from TN is typically triggered by eating, talking, or brushing your teeth, but none of those activities seemed to trigger David's pain. His pain was a constant presence, regardless of what David was doing. And so this neurologist had ordered an MRI and CT scan to confirm her suspicion. And so now David hoped that on this phone call, he would be given finally a proper diagnosis and treatment plan. David crossed his fingers and answered the call. The neurologist said that after looking over his MRI, she found no abnormality involving his trigeminal nerve. That meant that the earlier diagnosis was incorrect, and David did not have TN. Instead, his CT scan showed that he might have a blockage in a sinus passage located at the back of his nose. She suggested that David's previous doctors had all been looking in the wrong place. She told him to go see another ear, nose, and throat doctor, because if she was right, the answer to David's pain could be a relatively easy fix. David couldn't believe it. After all this time, it seemed too good to be true. And so he promised the neurologist he would contact another ENT right away. Almost 2 years later, in May of 2023, a neurosurgeon named Dr. Sarah Howard stuffed down a quick lunch while reviewing the medical chart for her next patient. She was the director of neurosurgical oncology at a healthcare facility in Santa Barbara, California. And today, she was meeting with David, who had recently retired and moved to the beachside town. Dr. Howard threw her brown lunch bag into the trash, grabbed her tablet, and hurried down the hallway to the exam room where David was waiting. From the moment she entered the room, she could tell that David was on edge. But given how many specialists he had seen over the years, she understood why. David explained that the last doctor he saw was a neurologist back in 2021. That doctor sent him to another ear, nose, and throat specialist to look for a blockage in his sinuses. But the ENT had not found anything wrong, so David felt like he was back to square one after 7 years of looking for answers. Feeling defeated and depressed, David had stopped hoping for a diagnosis at that point, and he had suffered excruciating pain ever since. It had been 7 years since the stabbing pain had started. He just needed it to stop. Dr. Howard brought up the MRI image of David's head that had been taken back in 2021. This was the MRI that supposedly showed he had a sinus blockage rather than TN. She flipped her tablet around so that David could see the image, and then on the image, she pointed at a small spot on his cheek. And while he looked, she told him that she knew exactly how to help him. David looked shocked, but he also tensed up because to this point, nobody seemed to know how to help him. But Dr. Howard seemed very confident, and she told him that the solution was brain surgery. However, because of his complicated medical history, the procedure would be extremely risky and with no guarantees. In fact, she told him there was a 70% chance the surgery would not relieve his pain at all. In fact, it might even make the spasms worse. The last thing Dr. Howard wanted was for David to have unrealistic hopes here and to undergo a risky procedure only to wind up suffering even more than he was now. But Dr. Howard said, look, this is your best chance of relief, but ultimately, the choice is up to you. Dr. Howard waited while David tapped his fingers nervously on his knees, thinking it over. Finally, he asked her to show him the MRI one more time. She handed him the tablet and let him enlarge the scan, looking at that little spot she had pointed out on his cheek. Finally, after staring at the image for several moments, David said he had made up his mind. He was willing to take the risk. It's unclear why David's previous doctor didn't see it on the 2021 MRI scan. But the small spot on David's cheek that Dr. Howard pointed out was a group of blood vessels compressing his left trigeminal nerve. Although she wasn't sure if surgery could correct the condition, the image made her absolutely certain that David did, in fact, have a case of trigeminal neuralgia, or suicide disease, TN. So in that sense, David's earlier doctors had been right. But unlike any of his doctors up to that point, Dr. Howard actually knew how to fix it. In June of 2023, Dr. Howard performed that very risky brain surgery. It's known as a microvascular decompression, and she performed it on the left side of David's head. She drilled a small hole through his skull behind his left ear to expose the trigeminal nerve. Then she slowly lifted away the blood vessels that were pressing on the nerve and stuck a nearly microscopic Teflon pad between the blood vessels and the nerve. That way, the blood vessels could not compress the nerve any longer, and that would theoretically alleviate David's pain. But unfortunately, during the surgery, Dr. Howard hit a snag. She found that some small veins had become entangled with David's trigeminal nerve, making it difficult to completely relieve the pressure. That complication made her worry about how David would feel in the future. Following the surgery, the pain in David's face did diminish, however, it did not go away completely. He also felt intermittent compression behind his ear, which Dr. Howard explained was likely due to nerve scarring, since it had been so many years since the first cheek spasm that was likely caused by these veins. Dr. Howard warned David that that compression feeling might end up being permanent. But David finally found his way back to a sense of normalcy, though he wishes he had done more of his own research when the spasms first started happening. He thinks that maybe he would have ended up in a neurosurgeon's office much sooner, saving himself a lot of time, money, and pain. On the morning of August 16, 1942, a woman named Ida Ruby was riding her horse on a dirt path right near a beach just south of San Francisco, California. Now, during the week, Ida was a telephone operator, but it was a Sunday, so she had time off, and the way she liked to spend her time off was by riding her horse along the coastline and, looking out at the beautiful water and taking in the nature and all these unbelievable cliffs that went down to the water. I mean, this was a beautiful area, and every time Ida would go out and do this little ride around, she would bring binoculars with her. And so anytime she saw something of interest, she would stop and, use her binoculars to see what it was, like animals or things out over the water. And on this particular Sunday, Ida turned a corner, and as soon as she did, something caught her attention off to her right, out over the water. And so she stopped her horse and she turned and she looked out, and the sea was very calm, and she could see way out just past the horizon was what looked like this black thing kind of hovering over the water. And instead of raising her binoculars right away, she just kind of squinted and looked off in the direction, and she quickly realized what it was. It was a blimp. Now, today, when we hear the word blimp, we very likely think of the Goodyear blimp that kind of sits over sporting events, with the big Goodyear logo stamped on the side of it. It's basically a big balloon with a gondola that sits underneath it for the person who's driving it and passengers. And that's actually exactly what Ida was seeing, a big oversized balloon with a gondola underneath it. But this was not a Goodyear blimp, it was a military blimp. Because this was 1942, right in the middle of World War II. And 9 months earlier, the United States had joined World War II after the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And ever since then, Japanese submarines had been lurking off the coast of California, kind of all across the West Coast, out in the Pacific Ocean, and occasionally they would send torpedoes out and bomb the US mainland. And so the United States responded to this by launching this fleet of blimps that basically were able to get really low to the water, that could move really slowly, and they would basically fly all along the Pacific coastline looking for Japanese submarines. They could literally go down, and from their gondola, they could look down and actually see submarines and mark them for bombing runs or, scare them off. And so Ida, like anybody else who was living on the west coast of the United States at the time, was aware that there were blimps out over the ocean, but it was still a fairly uncommon sight. And so because of that, Ida was sort of intrigued, and so she raised her binoculars and she focused on this blimp, and she would see something that was so strange that even 80 years later, nobody can fully explain it. But to really understand why what she saw was so weird, we need to back up about 5 hours on the same day to about 6 a.m. at a military base just north of where Ida was seeing this blimp. And so at 6 a.m. at this military base, that particular blimp that Ida would later see was at this military base on the ground, and some Navy pilots and mechanics were preparing the blimp for a routine mission out over the San Francisco Bay to look for Japanese submarines. The intended path this blimp was going to take on this day was it would leave the base, and the pilot would take it over the famous Golden Gate Bridge, and then it would travel 28 miles to the west to the Farallon Islands. And then from there, the pilot would go 20 miles to the north to a peninsula called Point Reyes, and then from there, the pilot would head south along the coastline all the way back to base. This whole mission profile was scheduled to take about 4 hours. The pilots for this mission were going to be a 27-year-old Navy lieutenant named Ernest Cody and a 34-year-old officer named Charles Adams. And both of them were very experienced blimp pilots. They had done missions like this many times before. This was going to be a very routine mission for them. And then also, in addition to those two pilots, there would be a Navy mechanic who would join the two pilots in case there was any malfunctions with the blimp during the mission. And so everything was going to plan with this blimp that morning. There was nothing unusual about this mission, but right as the two pilots and the mechanic were literally getting inside of the gondola to begin this mission, Lieutenant Cody looked down at the control panel inside the blimp, and he noticed the blimp was way heavier than it should have been. Now, you have to understand that the level of rigor that went into preparing these blimps for flight was really intense. I mean, they were weighing every little thing that was put inside of this blimp because it was a really important part of flying these blimps, understanding how heavy it was. And so for this to be too heavy just made no sense. And so at first, Cody and Adams began like tapping on the control panel, thinking maybe the panel itself was malfunctioning, and if they hit it hard enough, the little ticker would go back to a normal weight. But despite, hitting the panel, it still showed it was too heavy. And so they flagged over the mechanic who was going to be joining them on the flight anyways. And the mechanic looked and kind of thought for a second and then realized, that day it had been very foggy. And so it was totally possible that all this extra moisture in the air had stuck to the surface of the balloon. And so collectively that had added quite a bit of weight. I mean, this is a massive balloon, a lot of surface area, a lot of water. Now, this was not some crisis. At worst, this was an inconvenience. Basically, they had to wait until this moisture kind of burned off once the sun came out, and then they could fly the blimp. But Cody and Adams, they just didn't feel like waiting. This mission was so routine, so simple, they'd done it so many times. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams decided that the easiest and fastest solution to this problem was simply to tell the mechanic who was going to come with them on this mission to not come with them. Without his weight inside of the gondola, even with this extra moisture in the blimp, it wouldn't matter. The blimp would still be light enough to fly with just the 2 pilots on board. The mechanic didn't care, so he hopped off, and then Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams took their seats inside the gondola, and sure enough, when they looked at the control panel, the blimp was ready to go. It was light enough. And so Lieutenant Cody fired up the blimp's engines, and just after 6 a.m. that morning, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams lifted off the ground and began their routine mission. About an hour and a half later, at 7:38 a.m., Lieutenant Cody radioed back to air control, saying that so far the patrol had been totally routine, everything was going smoothly, they hadn't seen any Japanese submarines or anything out of the ordinary, and also Lieutenant Cody said they were positioned just east of the Farallon Islands, which meant they were exactly on course, and really everything did seem to be going exactly to plan. But 4 minutes later, Lieutenant Cody radioed back again to air control, and he said they had just spotted an oil slick down on the water. So basically, picture from their perspective, they saw that gleaming oil sitting on top of the ocean. And so at the time, this often signaled that below the surface of the water, under this oil slick, was a submarine. So this is like a telltale sign that the Japanese could be right here. So Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams told air control that they were going to descend in the blimp down to the water and fully investigate this oil slick, and then they'd report back. This last transmission happened at 7:50 a.m. A few minutes later, a fishing boat named the Daisy Gray was gliding slowly through the water just east of the Farallon Islands, when all of a sudden the captain, who's looking straight ahead, he turned the boat and he happened to see straight ahead of him this massive blimp, the same blimp Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were in, descending very quickly through the clouds down towards the water. And remember, this was a pretty cloudy day, and so really this blimp kind of came out of nowhere, and this fishing boat captain was very aware that anytime blimps were out over the water, that was because they were looking for enemy submarines. And this captain realized he was heading right now straight in the direction of wherever this blimp was descending towards. And so the captain looked out ahead, and he saw that big oil slick on top of the water, maybe 100 yards away from him, and so he put it together that, oh my gosh, this blimp is going to that slick. That means there's an enemy submarine basically right there. And so in a panic, the fishing boat captain called to his crew to pull in the fishing nets, and he turned the wheel as fast as he could, and he hit the accelerator, doing everything he could to get away from this blimp. Because he knew that typically what happened when a blimp came down and actually found a submarine is they sometimes dropped bombs on the submarine. I mean, this is warfare. And so the fishing boat captain is getting away as fast as he can, and as soon as he's turned around, he looked back and he saw the blimp was now about 30 feet over the water, and someone inside the gondola was now leaning out over the side, and they dropped 2 things directly into the water, into that oil slick. And then seconds later, these huge plumes of smoke were coming out of the water. The person had just dropped some flares, basically marking where this submarine was. And so now the captain knew, okay, it's a submarine, and the next thing is very likely going to be a bomb, like a depth charge is going to be dropped right there. And so again, the captain's just speeding his way as fast as he can, hoping that if they do drop a bomb, it doesn't affect him and his crew. And so after making it another couple 100 feet away from this blimp, the captain again turned around, expecting to see this blimp still hovering where it was, because again, they had just dropped flares. They're preparing to do something major right there. But now when the captain turned around, he saw the blimp was no longer hanging out over the water. The blimp was now rocketing back up into the clouds like as fast as it possibly could. And before long, the blimp was gone. It disappeared into the clouds. And there had been no bomb dropped. I mean, nothing really happened beyond marking the water. So it was like, what's going on with this blimp? Meanwhile, back at air control, the last thing they heard from Lieutenant Cody was, hey, we see this oil slick down below, we're going to investigate, and we'll radio back when we're done. And so Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, they had clearly descended down to the water because that fishing boat saw it happen. But then after they rocketed back up to the clouds for some reason, they never radioed back to air control. And so air control is waiting and waiting. They're not hearing back from Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And finally, they began hailing the two pilots to say, hey, what's going on? You said you were going to investigate. What'd you find? What happened? But they could not get in touch with Lieutenant Cody or Officer Adams. And so eventually, after enough time had passed and they still had not heard from these pilots, air control sent 2 seaplanes out to that area east of the Farallon Islands to find the blimp and make sure the blimp was okay. But when the seaplanes got out there, they couldn't find the blimp anywhere. I mean, they flew all over the place doing wider and wider circuits. There was no sign of the blimp. And when they looked down at the water in the same area where Lieutenant Cody had called out that slick and where that fishing boat had also seen the slick, well, the slick was gone, or the seaplanes just couldn't see the oil slick. But the seaplanes stayed on station in that area near the Farallon Islands for another 2 hours, just flying all over the place, kind of hoping to eventually see this blimp. And eventually they would. At about 10:30 a.m. that morning, one of the seaplanes spotted the blimp way, way high in the sky, like way higher than any blimp would ever go. It is dangerously high, and it was way off course. But when these 2 seaplane pilots began flying towards the blimp to get eyes on the pilots inside of this blimp, Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams, well, when they got close enough, the blimp just began rapidly descending, like it was trying to avoid being seen by these seaplanes. And in fact, the blimp descended so quickly that it dropped below the cloud cover, and the seaplanes, they couldn't move that quickly. They had to do a big track to turn back around and try to go lower again. But once they got below the clouds to find this blimp, the blimp was gone. It basically had vanished. And so the seaplane pilots called back to air control, and they're like, I don't know what's going on with this blimp, but it's way off course. It was way up in the sky. Now it's somewhere down below, but we can't find it. We got to get in touch with Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. There's obviously something wrong. But air control would try over and over again to get in touch with these pilots, but neither Cody nor Adams ever responded. They had just gone totally radio silent. And at the same time this chaos with this blimp is happening, Ida Ruby, the woman at the beginning of the story, was riding her horse on that dirt path near the beach just south of San Francisco, and she looked out over the water and she saw that blimp. And so Ida Ruby, she stops, she raises her binoculars, and she looks at this blimp. And after she focuses her binoculars, she realizes there's obviously something wrong with this blimp. The actual balloon portion of the blimp, which said Navy on it, had collapsed so much in the middle that you couldn't even read the word Navy. It was all crumpled together because, again, the balloon is like deflated. And also she saw that this blimp appeared to just be kind of listing as if the wind was blowing it and it was not being directed by the pilots inside. And this blimp appeared to be getting blown directly towards Ida. And so she lowered her binoculars and she looked out with her naked eye, and sure enough, this crumpled up blimp that was still afloat but clearly was not doing too well was getting closer and closer and closer to her. And as it was getting lower and lower to the ground, and she's starting to worry it's going to smash into her. But right as this blimp was about to pass basically right over her head, she raised her binoculars one more time and she got a clear look inside of the gondola where Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams would have been. Now, Ida Ruby has no idea who's supposed to be inside of this blimp and who isn't, or even what they're doing, but she definitely recalled exactly what she saw inside of that gondola, and that's the thing that has troubled everybody for so many years. Because what she saw was 3 people inside of that gondola. And if you recall, that gondola only ever contained 2 people. It was Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams. But now, Ida Ruby is looking up, and clear as day, there are 3 people in that gondola. Even though at no point was there 3 people. It didn't leave with 3. It didn't come down and take more people on board. It made no sense that there were 3 people inside of that gondola. Again, Ida Ruby wouldn't have known that, but when that information got passed, this was like how could that be? And so after seeing the three men inside of this blimp, Ida lowered her binoculars and watched in horror as this deflated blimp drifted just above her, like practically arm's length above her, and careened over the cliffs behind her and smashed into the ground. And then seconds later, Ida began hearing sirens going off in Daly City, which was located right behind her. That was the nearest town. And so as the blimp came in for a crash landing in Daly City, it scraped across a couple of residential rooftops and hit a couple power lines before kind of coming to a stop in the middle of the street. Now, the blimp didn't explode or catch on fire or anything. It just kind of crumpled to the ground and nobody got out of it. It just kind of stopped and it was there right in the middle of the street. And very quickly, first responders rushed to this blimp because there have been so many reports of this deflated blimp looking like it was about to crash. And so they had been tracking it, and here it was. And so they ran up to this blimp. But at some point, one of the first responders ran up to the gondola itself where the door was slightly open, and they opened it up, hoping to find there would be some survivors inside. But when he looked inside of this relatively small space, there was nobody in there. And there was no sign that anybody had been in there. There was no blood or anything. It was just an empty gondola. But remember, minutes before, not even, Ida Ruby had clearly seen 3 people inside of that gondola. So to go from 3 people to none in the space of a couple hundred feet as everybody's watching this thing come into crash land in Daly City, where could they have gone? And even weirder was when they looked inside of the gondola, they discovered that basically everything was functioning perfectly fine. It was unclear how it became deflated because, again, all the controls inside of this thing were working just fine. And also, the parachutes were still inside of this gondola. If you're going to jump out, you need a parachute, but they were in here. And also the life raft, it was still inside of the gondola. It was like there was nothing wrong with the blimp. And so this whole situation made no sense. The Navy would launch an exhaustive investigation into what happened with this blimp. And the only explanation the Navy came up with was, well, it looks like Officer Adams and Lieutenant Cody just fell out of the blimp at the exact same time and they disappeared into the ocean. However, both pilots were wearing life preservers and would not have taken those off. That was absolutely 101 for being a pilot of one of these blimps. And so they would have had these life preservers on, and even if they had fallen out and perished, they would have floated to the surface, or if they landed on land, they would have likely been found. I mean, the entire route they had been on was heavily scrutinized and searched, but the bodies were never found. And then also, the Navy could not explain how Ida Ruby clearly saw 3 people absolutely 100 feet away from her inside of that gondola. She had no reason to lie about that. She was just saying, yeah, I looked up, saw 3 people, saw it crash into Daly City. She didn't know there was supposed to be 2 people. She was just calling what she saw. But the Navy had no explanation. And so in the years that have followed this empty blimp crash in Daly City, it's been dubbed the ghost blimp story, and loads of theories circulate about what could have happened here. Some people say that, the reason there was all that extra weight at the beginning of the mission profile at 6 a.m. was not because of moisture on the balloon, but because there had to have been maybe a stowaway somewhere in the blimp, and then after takeoff, they jumped down into the gondola, and maybe they were responsible for whatever happened to the pilots and why the blimp crashed. But it doesn't explain what happened to those 3 people. What happened to the stowaway? What happened to Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams' body? We don't know. Other theories include that maybe Lieutenant Cody and Officer Adams were somehow captured by the Japanese, and some other people say, maybe Cody and Adams were abducted by aliens. But as far-fetched as these theories might seem, the truth is, we really have no idea what happened on that ghost blimp. Downright disturbing. And so today, I'm going to be looking at the real story that movie is based on, which is, of course, the exorcism of Annalise Michel. But before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, well, then you've come to the right channel, because that is literally all I do. And I upload 3, sometimes 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, if you could, please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe and turn on all post notifications so you don't miss any of my weekly uploads. All right, let's dive in. Annalise Michel was born in 1952 in Western Germany to a fiercely religious family. Devout Catholics who believed in some of the more extreme elements of the Catholic faith. Now, one of the things that they believed in and certainly pushed on to Annalise and her siblings was this idea that sin could not be atoned on your own. It would require other people effectively sacrificing on your behalf for you to be absolved of your sin. And so Annalise and her siblings would be instructed by her parents to, at times in the winter, sleep on the hardwood floor in order to repent for sinners that can't repent for their sins on their own. And so she'd be laying on the floor in the middle of the winter, thinking that what she was doing was saving other people from their own sin. In 1969, Annalise would have her first seizure. She was at school, she suddenly started seizing up and convulsing, and her classmates would later tell investigators and her family that it was almost like she'd entered into a trance-like state while she was having this seizure. And then as soon as the seizure had ended and she was done convulsing, she snapped out of the trance-like state. It wasn't until a year later when Annalise had another seizure in the middle of the night. She had this convulsion and her parents come in and she's in this trance-like state and she's wet the bed and then she snaps out of it and she doesn't know what happened. It wasn't until this second seizure that the family actually sought medical attention. They actually went to a neurologist. That neurologist would tell Annalise and her family that what she was suffering from was something called temporal lobe epilepsy, where, amongst a litany of horrible side effects, a few of the more significant ones are serious auditory and visual hallucinations, a loss of awareness, and intense mental state. So Annalise was prescribed medication by this neurologist to try to combat this temporal lobe epilepsy, but it didn't seem to do anything. And in fact, her seizures and convulsions and this trance-like state she would go into during the seizures, it only persisted and intensified. And it got to a point where Annalise and her family believed the best thing for her to do would be to go to a psychiatric hospital where the staff there was better equipped to handle what was happening to her. And so she checks in willingly, and they start experimenting with different drugs, and nothing seems to work. And in fact, her condition only gets worse. She starts having more seizures and more convulsions, and she starts having a regular visual hallucination. Whether she's having a seizure or not, everywhere she looked, if she looked at anybody in the face, their face would become demonic. Like it would be a demon's face that would look at her and say, "You're going to rot in hell." And so she began not being able to look at people in the face, and she would tell the nurses and doctors, like with her head down, about these demon faces she was seeing. And it was the first time she began espousing this idea that she was in fact possessed by demons. In fact, 6 demons by her count. When she passed on that information to her family that she believed she was possessed, she and her family believed that the psychiatric hospital was not enough, and in fact modern medicine was really not enough to handle what was happening to her, that they would need to search for help outside of medicine, and so they turned to the Catholic Church. Initially, all the clergy that Annalise and her family approached to try to help her with the situation rejected her request, and they said, "You need to seek medical attention. This is not something we can help you with." Not knowing where to turn, her family is kind of at a loss. At the same time, Annalise's condition really nosedives. I mean, it was already pretty bad. It gets a lot worse. She began doing 400 plus squats every day, like compulsively doing squats. Then she began going under the table periodically and not coming out for 2 days, barking like a dog the entire time without sleeping. She began going to corners of the house and finding spiders and eating them off the ground. She would scurry over to the fireplace and pull coal out of the fireplace and eat the coal. I mean, she was really losing it. Finally, the family located a priest named Ernst Alt, who believed she was possessed and that she was not epileptic, and he was willing to petition the local bishop to allow the Catholic Church to perform an exorcism. And so that bishop granted permission for a local priest, Arnold Renz, to perform an exorcism with the full endorsement of the Catholic Church. Over the next 10 months, Renz would conduct 67 exorcisms of Annalise. And through these exorcisms, Annalise would reveal that she was being possessed by 6 demons: Lucifer, Cain, Judas, Nero, Fleischmann, and Adolf Hitler. And so all of these voices, these demonic voices that were coming out of Annalise, they were picked up on audio recording during the exorcisms. And in the movie, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, the most iconic scene in the movie is the demon scene where they show off these voices coming out of, in the movie it's Emily Rose, but it's supposed to represent Annalise Michel. And they do a fantastic job showing what that might have looked like during the exorcism. So take a look.
Give me your name, demon! Names! Names! Just see it. Ancient serpents, depart from this servant of God! Tell me your 6 names! We are the ones who dwell within. But you must go ahead, but I become a parrot. And I am Lucifer, the devil in the flesh.
And now I want you to take that scene you just watched of Emily Rose being possessed by these demons and think about that as you listen to the actual audio recordings of Annalise Michel during one of her many exorcisms.
Ja, ich will auch für die anderen Leute, damit die nicht in die Hölle kommen und so. Aber dass das dann so schlimm ist und so grausam und so furchtbar, nee.
Gekletze. Nein, Gekletze. Von der Mauer Gekletze. Oh, und der Hanna Milane.
Als Kind Gottes.
Ich hab dein Maul erschlagen. Die Ruhe gibt's nur da oben.
Ruhe gibt's nur dort, wo die Liebe ist.
Ja, bei uns gibt's nur ja nun. Die müssen in eigenen Seminaren ausgebildet werden, die dürfen nicht auf die anderen Universitäten. Kapiert?
Geistes. Geboren hier auszufahren und nicht.
Initially, the exorcisms seemed to make things better for Annalise. She got to a place where these seizures and convulsions and trance-like states and odd behavior were so few and far between that she actually re-enrolled in university and was even able to attend church, but it didn't last. In the spring of 1976, Annalise's convulsions and seizures and odd behavior came back tenfold, and she began becoming violent with her family members to where they couldn't even be around her without being attacked by her. But when she was left on her own, she would harm herself. She stopped eating, saying that the demons were not allowing her to eat, and all day long she would stand up and then drop to her knees to pray, and then get back up and drop to her knees to pray, breaking both her kneecaps and tearing the tendons in her knees, which seemingly did not faze her. But still, her family believed that what she needed was religious intervention, not medical intervention. Also, Annalise felt the same way, but some might say that she was not in a position to make that decision, that she had lost her ability to make that decision. But either way, they continued with the exorcisms. The final exorcism of Annalise took place on June 30th, 1976, and while Annalise did submit willingly to this exorcism, she was incredibly frail. She weighed under 100 pounds, and by the following morning, on July 1st, 1976, she had passed away due to dehydration and malnutrition. She was only 23 years old. After her death, Annalise's story was so sensational that it grabbed headlines all over Germany, and people were clamoring to learn more about how this could happen. That she was, apparently possessed and then died after all these exorcisms. Why wasn't there medical intervention? There was so many questions. And so ultimately what happened is her parents were charged with negligent homicide, but were actually not given a jail sentence because at the time in Germany, they ruled that the parents had already suffered enough, so they did not serve any jail time. And there were two priests, one of them being Renz, who were charged with negligent manslaughter, and they were sentenced to 6 months in jail. That was later suspended. To this day, people are absolutely split down the middle about what actually happened to Anneliese Michel. Was it possession, or was it, like the neurologist said, a form of epilepsy, or was it something else? And furthermore, was psychiatric treatment or was modern medicine doing enough to help her? Or were they failing just as much as the exorcisms ultimately failed? It's a question that to this day people are really unsure how to answer. Her gravesite has become sort of like a monument for many churches around Europe. They will go and basically make the pilgrimage to her gravesite to pay their respects to a girl that they believe in some way died for their sins. So what do you think this was? Was this demonic possession, or was this epilepsy? Or was it something else? And how do you think they should have treated this case? I mean, obviously the medication she was on was not making it any better, but at the same time, the exorcisms didn't seem to do much better either. So how do you treat something like this? Let me know in the comments what you think, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I possibly can. All right, that's gonna do it, guys. If you were interested in this story and like this type of content, if you would please gently eviscerate the like button and then subscribe to this channel, turn on all post notifications so you can get the 3 to 4 weekly uploads that happen on this channel every week. If you want to get in touch with me, you can hit me up on Instagram. My handle is JohnBallen416. I'm also
begin to glow. Every road keeps moving forward to places we don't know. You wake up on the other side of a sunrise I can't see. Different streets and different stories, different versions we could be. Everybody has a playlist for the moments in their day. Some are running till tomorrow, some are finding their own way. Maybe we're like distant stars, shining through a different view, living under separate skylines, still connected like we always do. We're under different skies, chasing dreams and
very active on TikTok, where my handle is MrBallen as well. That's